Here on Earth, we have a very serious cosmological problem, and we see it almost every single day, and we don't even notice it. What's that problem? It's the problem of the moon. The moon that orbits planet Earth shouldn't exist. There is no scientific reason right now that the mainstream can give that explains why we have a moon that orbits in the manner that it does. For the vast majority of the planet, nobody thinks about this. The moon is always present. The moon has always been. The problem is that the moon shouldn't exist. Now, I know that sounds crazy when we first say it. The moon is there. Astronomers are so smart. They know how everything formed. They can explain everything. Can they? The interesting thing about the moon is that astronomers haven't explained anything regarding its formation, why it has the crater formations that it does, or for that matter, the geological formations in general that it has, or more importantly, how it got into the orbit that we see it in today. Now, I know what a lot of you are thinking. Astronomers have all this figured out. We know for a fact that billions of years ago, while the Earth was forming, while it was in a molten ball, some other planetary body hit the Earth and knocked off a ton of the Earth's crust. And all of that molten debris came back towards Earth and started to coalesce, due to gravity, of course, and would eventually form what we now see as the moon. This is where the moon would get its orbit. This is how the moon would form. And of course, during the formation process, there would be all kinds of meteorites flying around, and it would be smashing into the moon. Of course, for some weird reason, the Earth doesn't get smashed in by tons of meteorites, but let's not start talking about that just yet. Anyway, the reason why the moon is pockmarked, the reason why the moon has all of the geological features that we see right now, is because of basic impacts over billions of years. Eventually, the Moon-Earth system would settle into what we see today. It's that simple. The explanation, there it is, we're done, right? We have nothing else to talk about. There is nothing else to think about. It's right there. Astronomers have figured all of this out. But have they? Have they really? Did you know that there is zero evidence to support with any degree of confidence anything I just said? Astronomers cannot provide us with any evidence that would clear their version of where the moon comes from, how the moon got into its orbit, and why it is pockmarked the way it is with craters. They have nothing. If you ask an astronomer to provide you with 100% tested scientific evidence that supports and proves that entire story, guess what an astronomer is going to give you? They're going to give you nothing. They have nothing. There is no evidence to support any of this. And that's only if an honest astronomer is talking to you. The reality is the vast majority of astronomers are not. Or at the very least, they don't know they're not. Because what your average astronomer is going to do is they're going to tell you is that they have this simulation that they've run. And this simulation perfectly conforms with their hypothesis. And that must mean that it's real. Okay, once we get into simulations, we have all kinds of problems. But this is the kind of stuff an astronomer is going to tell you. Right? They're going to tell you, oh, it's obvious that all of those, craters on the moon are from meteorite impacts. Really? Really? All those perfectly circular craters are from meteor impacts? What? Go grab a rock right now. Grab a rock, go outside somewhere, find some sand or some dirt or some mud, whatever, some kind of a material that can be affected by the rock, and throw the rock at that material. You tell me what happens when you throw the rock into that dirt, mud, or sand, or whatever. Does it create a perfect circular ridged crater? No, it creates a huge debris field. It creates a mishmash of stuff that will radiate out from the impact side. A perfect circle will not be created. Now, you can do everything you can with trajectories. You can try to drop it from straight above, right? That's probably going to be your best bet. But even when you do that, what happens? You drop the meteor, or the rock in our case, but if we drop the rock and it smacks into the mud or the dirt or whatever material we are dropping it into, what happens? The rock will simply go plop, and it will plop right down in the middle. The rock will remain fine. It will sit there. And even more interesting, you're not going to get a perfectly thin, ridged crater. You're going to get what would essentially be a sort of pit. And this is the best case scenario that you can hope for to find some kind of circular formation from an impact. Right? We don't see that on the moon, do we? We don't observe that kind of a situation happening with craters. I'm getting ahead of myself right now. Basically, when we look at the moon, an object, a cosmological object that we take for granted every day, we find a situation to where the institutions in power in our society currently have an explanation for why it exists, how it came to be, and why it looks the way it does, and why it orbits the way it does. And very few people will question these answers. Now, it gets even crazier for the mainstream person and more unfortunate for the mainstream astronomer, because our ancient histories actually record a time where the moon didn't exist. Now, this part of ancient history is ignored because it's too fantastical. The moon has always been. Our simulations prove that the moon is billions of years old. Look at all the evidence that we have from all of the conjecture that we've created that nobody will question. Because the second you start to question the mainstream perspective on the moon and why it exists, everything starts to crumble. And then when we start to listen to our ancestors, when they claim and tell us that there was a period of time not too long ago that the moon did not exist in orbit around the Earth, we find a situation to where our world view drastically changes. Gradualism is thrown out of the window. Uniformitarianism is no longer needed. Why are we ignoring our ancestors, by the way? Why do we believe something that has been simulated on a computer over what our ancestors claim happened? Isn't that interesting? How we will believe garbage on a screen over what our ancestors went out of their way to record. Now, I'm already going off on a tangent, and I've completely lost the scope of what I wanted to talk about. So, okay, let's focus up. We have a weird problem in history. We have a situation in history to where the moon, an object we have all grown up with, an object that has been in the sky our entire lives, if you're alive right now, unless you're a vampire or something and have been alive for thousands of years, but vampires don't count. I'm talking about humans right now. If you're a human, you have had the moon present in your life for its entirety, and you don't really think about it, right? Most people do not give a second thought to the moon, right? It's just not in our face. It doesn't matter. It sits up there. It orbits really slowly. We don't really see it move, right? That's how slow it moves. I mean, it does move, but you can't really see it with the naked eye unless you're a schizo and stare at it for like an hour. Otherwise, the moon, it just exists. It's like anything else. It's like the sky. Right? The sky is always there. You don't care. You don't think about it. Yeah, whatever. The sky. And you move on with life. Same with the moon. But think about what the moon is. We have like this huge planetary body orbiting us, and we can see its surface with the naked eye. I mean, it's crazy. We can see this unbelievable amount of destruction with the naked eye orbiting around our planet, and we don't give it a second thought. It's really crazy. if you really start to think about the moon. Now, the moon gets even more crazy, by the way, when you start to dive into the particulars of how it currently operates. What I mean by that is for example, when you look at the orbit of the moon. The moon's current orbit is essentially a circle. No, it's not a perfect circle. Okay, I know there's going to be smart asses out there who are going to attack on this, and I'm not claiming it's a perfect circle. It's not. It isn't. But what's interesting is that it is not too far away. Now, this may not sound like a big deal, but if we factor in orbital mechanics, a huge question arises, and I am not the first person to ask this question, and in fact, credit where credit is due, there have been great astronomers who have asked this question, and of course they were summarily ignored. But the question is, how did it get into that particular orbit? Currently, orbital mechanics, Newtonian physics, does not allow the moon to achieve its current orbit naturally. And this is one of the huge challenges that astronomers try and explain away using their simulations. So when you look at a simulation of the moon being formed, they don't tell you all of the little variables that they had to tweak to try and get all of that material to form around the Earth and get it into the orbit that it currently has today. This is why the simulation thing is absolute garbage. Because the amount of little things they have to force into that simulation to create the current outcome that we currently see, it's amazing, and it's unnatural. It's literally unnatural. You can literally take it as a playing God situation. And this is actually interesting. And I say playing God, I guess what I really should say is that to get the moon into its current orbital situation, it quite literally takes intelligent design to do it. What I mean by that is that it takes some other force to want to purposefully create the orbit. And now we get to what I want to finally talk about. Okay, let's start talking. So what does any of this... 12 minutes into this garbage, and we haven't even begun to start talking about what I want to talk about. So let's do this. So what we are going to do today is we are going to dive into the surface level basics of the moon regarding things like chronology, mythology, astronomy, and really any kind of cross-cultural anthropology that we can find. The reason why I want to do this is because in future shows, we will end up diving deeper into individual cultures who talk about all kinds of, crazy things that went on in the past. And, I get it, we've already discussed countless crazy things, but it's going to get crazier. It's got to get crazier. So far, everything that we've discussed up to this point has been fairly surface level. And the reason why I did that was just so that we could start getting a basic idea of the problems and the questions that we need to ask when it comes to history and science. And we still have a little ways to go before this channel starts, going total schizo. But anyway, today, I want to go over some of the stuff dealing with the problem of the moon, and by extension, the 360-day calendar. One of the major aspects of history that historians will brush off, they brush off all kinds of major stuff in history, but one of the major discoveries that historians don't acknowledge ever, and nobody really pays attention to, is the fact that civilizations all over this planet had a 360-day calendar. And I mean that all over the planet. I am not just talking in one or two little centralized areas on Earth. No, we have the Egyptians with a 360-day calendar, Sumerians, Hebrews, Persians, Indians, Mayan, Chinese. We have all kinds of pre-Islamic Arab civilizations with the 30-day calendar. Even the early Greeks and Romans had this calendar. When we keep looking around, we find that the Andean cultures had this, Polynesians had it, and even African tribes had the 30-day calendar. What is going on? It would be one thing if we found a situation to where one or two cultures on this planet had a 30-day calendar. Okay, fine, one or two cultures is just absolutely stupid. For whatever reason, they decided there has to be a very nice, even 360 days, even though it obviously doesn't work. But whatever, right? They needed it, they used it, they're cave people, whatever. But that's not the case. Everyone has it. Every single continent who had a culture that was keeping a calendar that we know of right now had a 360-day calendar. Okay, so something else has to be going on, right? Statistically, we are way outside of the bounds of this being a statistical anomaly. Once we find that civilizations all over the earth are sharing an identical calendar, what this tells us is that the people in those civilizations were simply observing the natural world around them and deriving the calendar from that world. So what I mean is that the entire world was deriving their calendar from a very particular cosmological formation or a cosmological environment that they lived in during that time. And interestingly enough, the 360-day calendar is not based on the solar calendar. No, they used the moon. Now, in the modern age, if we were to use the moon as a calendar, we would not get 360 days. All right, this is not going to happen. The current lunar month that we see in the modern day is not a nice, even 30 days. See, here's the thing about the lunar calendar. Everybody had a 360-day calendar based on the moon. What this means is that the moon had an extremely uniform orbit around planet Earth that gave it a precise 30-day orbit. Now that's insane. I don't care how you slice that. That is mind-boggling insane. Of course, in the modern day and age, we don't witness that kind of moon. We don't see a perfectly 30-day rotation of the moon or orbit of the moon. Our moon right now orbits around 29.53 days, right? That's the Sidonic month right now. So if we were to use the moon to calculate the year, we would come out with 354 days for the year, or 354 and change. It's a little over than that. But it's not going to be 360. So, in the modern age, using the moon makes absolutely no sense whatsoever, right? And the reason why is because we would be, 11 days off, basically? 11 days off every year. After a couple of years, I promise you, we would all start noticing that something isn't lining up with the seasons, right? And of course, within a human lifetime, the calendar would be so off. I mean, everybody would notice it. It would be impossible not to notice. And if we're honest, at that point, pretty much every civilization would have to be like, all right, hold on. What's going on? Like, why are we doing this? This is stupid. Obviously, the year is not 360 days. All of our crops are off. Other timings for other chronological purposes within our society is off. We've got to do something to fix this, right? But they don't do that. Like these civilizations run efficiently on a 360-day calendar. Now remember, the civilizations who are running off of this calendar, these are not cave people, right? No matter what a historian will tell you, these people were smart, obviously. These are the same people who are supposedly building pyramids, right, in Egypt. These are the same people in South America who are building the structures down there. These are the same people who are building Baalbek, etc., etc. All these insane structures all over Earth are being built by people using a 360-day calendar. These cultures would have absolutely noticed if the 360-day year didn't work. But they don't change it, do they? No, they use it. So this really begs the question, why do we have civilizations all over the planet employing a calendar which by today's standards are completely wrong and off, but they're also still doing amazing things like building mathematical equations into their buildings and executing huge architectural feats? Like, none of this makes sense. If you look at this through common sense, if you look at an ancient historian, like a modern day ancient historian, and you just see how they look at the world, those people are insane. They're absolutely insane. And this is one of the reasons why they have to ignore the 360-day calendar. They have to ignore the fact that these ancient civilizations used the 360-day calendar, because if they acknowledge it, what that means is that shows us that something else entirely was going on in humanity's past. There's no other way around it. Something else was going on. And whatever that was, it was happening not too long ago. Right? We're talking maybe at best a couple of thousand years ago. Now, obviously, gradualism, uniformitarianism won't allow that. You can't have a different cosmological order only a couple of thousand years ago. That's impossible. Except it isn't. Scientifically speaking, there is nothing stopping a completely different cosmological order from existing during the time that the people had a 360-day calendar. If we use logic and reasoning, what happens? We come out looking at, oh yeah, it makes sense. They used a 360-day calendar because they had a 360-day cosmological sequence happening during the time they were alive. It is literally that simple. We do not have to jump through hoops. We can just look at the evidence and listen to what they say. And of course, an ancient historian will not do this. What they will do instead is they will simply say that the people who are using a 360-day calendar were just too stupid to realize that the year was 365 days. That's their number one answer, because they don't have anything else. If you poke them a little further, some of them will get creative. Some of the ancient historians will actually start to invoke some pretty good intelligence that our ancestors would have had. They will start bringing up geometry, right? 360 days is the same as 360 degrees. The ancients must have known that we rotated around the sun, and of course, they would have thought we were rotating around in a perfect circle, so they used 360 because it made geometric sense. If you really want to do a deep dive into their explanation, right, they'll start talking about all kinds of things like, well, 360 is divisible by 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8, 9, 10, blah, blah, blah. It's perfect for mapping geometry in the sky, right? Or it's also easy for dividing the heavens into zones, because they can look up at the sky, divide it in 360 degrees, and that makes sense because once again we come back into the circular situation. And geometrically it does. This all sounds fantastic. Once you start looking and getting deeper into things like the zodiacs, or dealing with ecliptic paths using 360 based numbers, this really starts to make sense relative to what we find in the ancient histories. So a historian can kind of play with this stuff, right? It's crazy. 360 degrees in a circle. There are 12 signs at 30 degrees. So we do 12 months at 30 days, and it all lines up relative to what the ancients are saying, even though technically speaking, it's completely cosmologically incorrect. Right? This is what the ancient historians will do. Now, that is one hell of an excuse. Right? That is one hell of an explanation, because these are the same people that will tell us that everybody thought the world was flat back in the day, right? Which is it, ancient historians? Right? None of the modern day mainstream historians' explanations for any of this stuff make sense. It's all literal misdirection and garbage. And this is the reason why nobody really wants to discuss the problem. And it's a big problem. I mean, the reality is, when we look at a culture like the ancient Egyptians, they very clearly use a 360-day calendar composed of 12 months, accounting for 30 days in each month. Right, the Old Kingdom texts, which God knows how old those really are, talks about a time period where there was a 360-day structure. If we look over to the Sumerians, the Sumerians are basically the Babylonians and the Akkadians. We get there's that whole problem. I'm not going to get into those guys. But anyways, if we look at them, we also find the exact same situation, right? They're using calendars comprised of 12 months of 30 days each. Now, the interesting thing about the Sumerian calendar is that historians will literally say something to the degree of, well, they did use the 360-day schematic year to create their 360-degree circle. It made sense geometrically, so that's why they did it. They were smart. Even though apparently they were too stupid to do other things. Who else? Oh, the Hebrews. Okay, Hebrews and Israelites. We have to talk about them as well. So I know the Old Testament gets weird, but it is what it is. But anyway, so even passages in the Old Testament imply 30-day months and a 360-day year. Like it's even in the Old Testament stuff. Now, once again, I know those writings get a little weird, but due to chronological situations and when the Bible was actually written and stuff like that. But don't forget, even if the Bible was indeed, comprised, composed, and fully created in the Middle Ages, it's still drawing from real ancient history, right? So the Bible is valuable in that sense, in that even though the Old Testament and the New Testament are just stitched together old stories, the old stories have some validity. So it's interesting to find that 30 month day and 360-day year calendar. Did I say that right? 30-day month, 360-day year. Whatever. That's in the Bible, right? It's very interesting that it's there. Even when they were comprising those books, they still put that stuff in there. And they did that to okay, anyway, it's a whole other thing. I just wanted to throw that out there. And another thing. So the Jewish apocalyptic literature that's out there, like Enoch and stuff like that, even Enoch uses a 360-day prophetic year. Yeah, how do you like that? I never really hear Enochian people who get into that ever talk about that aspect, right? Everybody has to glaze over this stuff. Even the alternative side doesn't really want to touch it because the reality is the vast majority of the alternative side is not equipped to really interpret any of this. And by interpret, I just mean take science and apply it to what they're reading, right? New science, better science, real science. Okay, anyway. Who else? Oh, yeah, the Persians. So when we look at Zoroastrian stuff over there in Iran, we find that they as well had a 360-day year. Now, this apparently lasts well into the Achaemenid and Caesarian eras. I can never say Achaemenid. Did I say that correctly? I can never pronounce that crap correctly. Anyways, the Zoroastrian situation, same thing. 360-day year. Okay, so I'm kind of focusing on the Middle East. Let's go to the Mayans. Right, so the Mayans have an interesting one because their first calendar is 260 days. But then that 260-day calendar, or what they will eventually call the long count, will eventually turn into 360 days. Now, this calendar is interesting because the 260-day portion of the calendar probably relates to the time before the 360-day calendar. Now that's kind of outside of the scope for this, but just throwing it out there for you Mayan researchers, if you guys are looking into the catastrophic area on that front, rewind the clock further back. It gets crazy, right? There was another calendar before the 360-day calendar. Okay, I'll stay focused. Another thing, if we look at the Vedic situation, so in the Vedic texts also describe a 360-day year. Same thing, 12 months, 30 days, right? They have all the different divas or gods of the year and all of that stuff. But the number is still the same. Right? So we have people in the Middle East, we have people in India, we have people in South America doing all of this stuff. Right? Now when we look at the ancient Chinese, right? I think it's the early Zhao period. I'm pretty sure it's the Zhao period. During the Zhao period, they have the same thing. They have the same 360-day year. Who else? The Romans and the Greeks, right? So I think so with the Greeks, we have a situation that before that whole Reformation thing, right? We find a situation to where Greek city-states all used 30-day lunar months. Now, the Greek side gets an explanation because, of course, the mainstream will say, well, there's all these, philosophers and mathematicians or whatever, and they're doing all of this stuff. So it made sense for them to calculate 360 days in a year because they were doing math. Like what? That is the excuse, right? That is the excuse that they will use. And they use that in other civilizations as well. But for the Greek one, it's the most egregious because it's claimed right now that ancient Greek had all of these philosophers and all of this math and stuff come out of it and blah, blah, blah. So mainstream historians, they just latch on to the 360-day, degree situation relative to geometry, relative to what they have been taught was done by ancient Greeks. Now, of course, there's no such thing as an ancient Greek civilization. So the people who were tracking the 30-day lunar months were a different civilization. Anyway, I don't want to get into that because we've talked about that. There's a whole thing there. But Rome does the same thing, right? Rome has the 30-day calendar too, right? All of the Etruscan stuff is also influenced by the same damn 360-day calendar. It's all right there. It's all the same stuff. Who else? Oh my God. You guys get it. I mean, you guys get it. Now, of course, we get to the major question, why? And I may have already asked that in this show. I don't remember anymore. I don't know where the hell I'm going with this anymore. But, okay, why? Right? It's a very simple question to ask a historian. And I've kind of covered some of it, but, what are the excuses, right? Well, we will get the mathematical convenience excuse, right? They'll say, oh, well, it was also just really easy to divide the heavens into 360 parts. Okay, I guess. They'll even make excuses like, oh yeah, well, it was really good administrative policy to use 360. Like, this is what they will say. They will do anything they can to get away from actually listening to and reading the real histories that explain what went down. So what happened? What is going on? Why is it that we have a situation to where our ancestors, for a period of time, in the relatively recent past, have a 360-day calendar based on a moon that rotated around the Earth at precisely 30-day intervals? Right? You can keep track of time using the phases of the moon. Think about it. If the moon right now had a perfect 30-day orbit, like a perfect one, around the Earth, I mean, that is an amazing way to tell time. It is much better than the solar way of telling time. Because remember, right now, the way the Earth orbits around the sun, right, we have all kinds of problems. There are really, and a lot of people don't really realize this, but there's a lot of variation in how the Earth technically orbits around the sun, right? And we have to account for this in our calendars. This is why we have a leap year, for example. Right? The Earth is not in a perfect circle around the sun. The Earth is in a variable elliptical orbit. Now, it's not variable in the sense that we go way out in the middle of deep space and come back. No, that's not what I'm saying. But relatively speaking, our orbit varies. It's not precise. Another thing that's interesting, actually, and it's not part of this show, but it deals with the sun. So during the time, apparently, that when we had the 360-day lunar calendar, It also sounds like the Earth was orbiting around the sun in essentially a perfect circle, or very close to a perfect circle, to where they were actually getting exactly 360 days out of the year from a solar perspective as well. Yeah, how do you like that? Now that like I said, that's kind of outside of the scope of this, but the people who were using the 360-day calendar, they were using both the moon and the sun, and they were 100% accurate. I mean, they would have had to have been, right? Like I said earlier, if calendars are off, people are going to notice. It does not take thousands of years to notice. It takes only a couple of years. You know, especially relative to how off they would be relative to today's orbital systems. Right? You just don't use it. So logic would dictate that there is indeed a cosmological reason why people would have been using the orbit, or would have been using the 360-day situation. So what happened? What changed? Our ancestors at some point in history obviously used and were happy with an accurate 360-day calendar. We cannot debate that. It's right there. All scientific and historical evidence support this conclusion. There's no way around it. Okay, great. Now we know that. But obviously, in the modern day and age, we don't have that calendar nowadays. I mean, I get it. There are still cultures in the modern time that still kind of try to carry on the 360-day calendar, and there's nothing wrong with that, but obviously it's no longer accurate. It doesn't work. They carry it on out of tradition, and that's fine. Like that's actually good. I'm glad to hear that, because it keeps the history alive. Yes, technically it's inaccurate, but it is a reminder to everyone on the planet that things at one point in time were different. Right? This is why, if you have ever wondered why you still see lunar calendars being held today, and they're obviously inaccurate, this is why. Right? This is literally ancient history being carried forward in our time. And people ignore it now, right? Because it's not accurate. And of course, if you try to take it as accurate in the past, there's no way, right? Everybody just thinks everybody in the past were monkeys. Okay, anyway, okay. So what happened? Something had to change. What was the change? And in fact, an even better question is, how the hell did we even get to the point to where we had a 360-day calendar in the first place? Like, where does it even begin? Now, the good news here is that the ancient histories tell us. The ancient histories talk about a very specific period in Earth's history, not more than 3,000 or 4,000 years ago, to where the gods were fighting in the sky. Now remember, on this channel, gods are not these metaphorical dudes in robes zapping each other with lightning and tickling each other on the butt in the sky. They're not doing that. Gods are real planets. When we say Zeus, we literally mean Jupiter. When we talk about Ares, the god of war, we mean Mars. And when we talk about Athena or Pallas Athene in the sky, we talk about the planet Venus. These planetary bodies, also known as gods, or as translated as gods nowadays, were very plainly planetary bodies that our ancestors were watching in the sky, and I do not mean little points of light. There is no reason for any ancient culture whatsoever to deify small points of light in the sky that you could barely pick out from other points of light. They all look the same. It's all the same garbage, basically. There's no reason to deify these small points of light as destroyers of worlds, as bringers of life. There's no reason for any of this. But everything changes once we start to look at the gods as the planets that our ancestors are actually talking about. In a very particular period in time, if you are a mainstream chronologist, this would be around the 1600s BC. If you are a real chronologist and you are looking for the real date, you're looking at about 2,000 years ago. There was a situation to where the planet Venus was still trying to find its orbit. Not only was Venus still searching for her orbit, Basically, all planetary bodies in the solar system at that period of time were still making their way into what would eventually become their current orbits. Now, there's nothing unscientific about what I just said. All of our ancestors talk about a large scale cataclysm that takes place that sends everything into absolute chaos. And that is what we would call Saturn theory. Now, I'm not going to get into that, but that is the beginning of all of this story. That is what will send the planet Venus into its erratic orbital motions, just like every other planetary body will also be sent into their erratic orbits. Now, don't forget, these orbits are not being driven by basic gravity. Gravity is the weakest force you can imagine. All of these events, all of these orbits are being driven by electromagnetism, by Birkeland currents, real forces with real power. During this particular chaotic time, we find our ancestors scrambling to simply survive. And eventually, things will calm down enough to where apparently civilizations will start to spring up. But all of that will end when the planet Venus starts to approach Earth and starts to cross over the Earth's orbit. To make the situation even more crazy and destructive, the planet Venus has a very high charge potential at this particular point in time, and so does the Earth. The problem is that both the Earth and Venus have opposite charges. What happens when two oppositely charged bodies come into contact with one another electrically? Yes, absolute destruction. And that is exactly what our ancestors discuss. As the charged planet Venus starts to soar towards the sun and cross over the orbit of the Earth, the planet Venus will turn into a comet. As it starts to shed charge due to acclimating to the electrical nature of the sun, our ancestors will witness this. They will see Venus as a comet. They will call her the hairy star. They will call her the star that smokes. The planet Venus will be a comet in the truest sense of the word. At some point in time, Earth will come into close contact with Venus. And this will happen several times, with at least one of the times so close that the two bodies will exchange electrical charges in the form of huge thunderbolts. Oceans will be dragged over the planet. Essentially, Earth's orbit will be completely shifted and changed. The planet will rock, and Earth will be sent into a state to where almost every living thing dies. After the encounter with Venus, it is said that the ancients figured that everything was over. After this event, there was almost no life left. There had been so much burning, so much water flooding, so many earthquakes, typhoons, hurricanes, you name it. Any destruction you can imagine had happened. And even worse, even things like petroleum and naphtha raining down on the planet, burying entire cities and burning entire continents. The ancients figured they were extinct. For some weird reason, that doesn't happen though. Because there is a point after this event to where some miracles start to happen. One of the greatest miracles is that this material called the honey of the gods, or milk and honey, or manna, will start to rain down from the sky for what is said to be centuries. All life on Earth, for some weird reason, was able to use this substance, which rained down on the planet from space, and this essentially saves life. Now, that does not stop the Earth from now being axially tilted, bouncing back and forth. If you want to know where the Earth's bounce came from, there you go. It was because of Venus. To make matters worse, people were still afraid the Earth would turn over and tip over. Chaos still sort of reigned on Earth. While living was now better, the orbit was not. Something had to show up to stabilize Earth's orbit. And that something, apparently, is our moon. Before the Venus event, the moon was not there. Or at least not in a capacity that it was orbiting Earth like it does now. The moon will show up, and when the moon shows up, all of a sudden Earth starts to balance itself out. When the moon shows up, the Earth no longer rocks completely out of control. The Earth's orbit is now suddenly stabilized, and to make matters even more interesting, humans now have an accurate way of telling time in the form of watching the phases of the moon. What the hell happened? How did the moon show up at just the right time to stabilize Earth after this horrific cataclysm? Now, I don't have an answer for this. I don't know how it shows up. All we know is that it does show up. When the moon shows up, when the moon is placed into orbit, suddenly the Earth starts to right itself, and humanity can now rebuild. Life in general gets to rebuild. Time is important to humans. The moon offers a chronology for people to time things on now. Remember, during the time after the Venus event, or directly after the Venus event, nobody knew what time it was anymore. Nobody knew where the sun was going to rise, right? It was absolute chaos. The world was showered and shrouded in absolute debris, not only from the Earth itself and all of the smoke and chaos, but from the tail of Venus's comet. When all of that starts to subside, everything is different. And people are worried about how they're going to recalculate the calendar during this period of time. It's a legitimate problem, and this is recorded because they need to know the time. The sun is now rising on the opposite side of where it used to rise. You know, how do you like that? The Earth flipped. That is what that is saying, that the Earth flipped. Our ancestors lived through the Earth flipping only a few thousand years ago. Right? The Earth would have kept having more troubles, except the moon shows up. The moon shows up, it stabilizes everything, and it provides a time-keeping piece for humanity. That's amazing. That's miraculous. For whatever reason, after the Venus event, humanity is quite literally saved by what I can only say is a miracle. Now, am I saying that a God did this? Absolutely not. Not even close. But remember what I said earlier in the show. The fact that the moon has an almost perfectly circular orbit is insane. In any of the simulations that any of the modern day scientists use to try to figure out how it got into the circular orbit, what did I say they had to do? They themselves had to manipulate the simulation to give them their outcome. It took some kind of an intelligence to do it. Isn't that weird? It really begs the question. Like, what was going on during this period of time? Like, why does the moon show up just at the right perfect time to save the scraps of humanity? Now, I know you can say that, well, I mean, realistically, humanity was lucky. I mean, obviously, nobody was trying to save them before the Venus event, and you can bring that up, and I agree, right? But this is where ancient history gets weird, right? Is it possible that there is something else that we're dealing with on Earth, right? That there are other whatevers out there, whatever. I don't know. This is where it gets weird. But the 360-day calendar is what comes out of the moon showing up. And then by extension, it sounds like the Earth was also placed in a perfect 360-degree orbit around the sun. There is no way this happened by chance. And then you can have even more fun, and you can factor in things like eclipses and how, for some weird reason, the moon perfectly goes over the sun. It perfectly eclipses the sun. Now, right now, I know there's people who are going to say, well, it's not perfect. No, it's not perfect right now, but it's still pretty damn good. But if we rewind the clock a little further back, the eclipse would be perfect. How do you get that level of perfection? Right? This is the question. Where did this come from? I am not the first person to look at the moon and think something is artificial about it. And I'm not talking about its construction. I have no idea what the moon is made of, right? I'm going to guess it's just an ejected body from a brown dwarf star. You know, once the electrical potential of a bunch of the garbage that forms inside of an electrical current gets spit out, that's a whole other topic. I would guess that's what the moon is comprised of. But the real question is the orbit. And of course, its very timely arrival to literally save humanity. Right? These are the problems that historians don't want to touch at all. And in fact, most people don't even know it is a problem and don't even know that this is what the ancient histories say, but it's everybody. Everybody has the exact same story. Everybody talks about the exact same event. And it's ignored. What happened a few thousand years ago? So, okay, the moon shows up, perfect timing. It gets placed into orbit. The Earth is saved. We have a 360-day calendar. Humanity can now rebuild. And that's what happens. Venus is no longer a threat. Venus has crossed Earth's orbit for the last time. It is now securely out of Earth's way. It's closer to the sun, never to bother Earth again. But something else has to happen to give us the current calendar, to give us the current orbit that we have now. What happens? There is one more cataclysm that Earth will have to survive. And this cataclysm may have taken place around 1,000 years ago. Yes, that close. And I know that sounds crazy, but when you factor in real chronology and real history, that's what the evidence shows. I don't know what to tell you. That's what the scientific evidence shows. Anyway, something else happens to the planet. There's one more minor, not minor, it's pretty major relative, it's pretty major. One more catastrophe will befall Earth. And that catastrophe is the zero event. The planet Mars is also still trying to get into its orbit. Earth will have several encounters with the planet Mars. Now, these encounters are nowhere near the level of destruction of the Venus event. Not even close. It's a completely different situation. Mars is not crossing Earth's orbit. It's just that Mars gets close enough to interact electrically with Earth. And here is where the 360-day calendar will be changed to 365. There is a point in ancient history, only around 1,000 years ago, to where every 12 years the planet Mars will come rather close to Earth. And by close, I mean it could have been about as big as we see the moon today in our sky. That's how close. The reason why we say this, or the reason why we can say this, is because cultures all over the planet already knew what Mars looked like. They knew it was the red planet. They knew about Valles Marineris, right? They knew it was the scarred god. They knew all of this, and they knew about the moons, Phobos and Deimos. They knew all of this. The only way people could have known about any of this is if they saw them. You don't need a telescope to see these features if the planet is that close. Isn't that amazing how it's such a simple explanation? This is recorded in histories everywhere. Every 12 years, Mars comes close and people are worried. And there is at least one close enough encounter to where the Earth will be affected. Earth's orbit will be permanently altered during one of these close encounters. Mars will pull at the Earth a little bit. When Mars pulls at Earth a little bit electromagnetically, it will pull it out of its 360-day orbit. It will create our current elliptical orbit. It will also tweak the moon. The moon, before this event, will have a perfect 30-day rotation around the Earth. However, after dealing with the Mars situation, after the zero event goes down, even the moon's orbit will now be slightly tweaked. No longer do we find a 30-day orbit, but now we come down to 29 point whatever. and it gets changed. This is how we got our current calendar. The last time Earth had an encounter with Mars, Mars literally adjusted the Earth's orbit from what it originally was after the Venus event took place and after the moon shows up. It's that simple. You don't need anything crazy. We don't need gods. All we need is standard astrophysics. That's it. It's all you need. Electromagnetism and some physics, and you've got it. We're done. Classical physics, by the way. That's it. See, it's that simple. The only thing that is stopping people from looking at this is the fact that we've all been trained to not take anything like this seriously. Everything has to be through uniformitarianism eyes. Everything has to take millions and billions of years. Well, our ancestors completely disagree, and so does real science. We lost the 360-day calendar because of the zero event, because Mars had several encounters with Earth. There's nothing weird about any of this, right? This is all very basic science. We don't have to magic anything. We don't need dark matter. We don't need, stupid gravity theories. We don't need anything. All we need is real science. And all of the stuff that our ancestors claim happened now suddenly makes sense. Now we know where we got our orbit from. Now we know why our ancestors had a 360-day calendar. Right? There it is. Right? It's crazy. Right? The implications, by the way, of everything that we just discussed is mind-boggling. For me personally, one of the crazier aspects of this now is, where the hell did the moon come from, and why did it show up at just the right time? And to make matters even crazier, how did it get in such a perfect orbit that it literally saved humankind? How did that happen? Right? That's not by chance. It's impossible. There's no way. There's no way it could have gotten in an orbit without, I don't know. The concept of the moon's orbit being artificial is nothing new. Right? This has been postulated or questioned by astronomers for a while. But nobody really knows what to do with it. Well, here, I just gave you something to help you out. If we mix real history with the questions science is asking, suddenly we have a real scientific picture of what has transpired in our past. What this also does is it also really makes you rethink some of the mythologies where you have, gods watching out for humans, other things helping humans, etc., etc. Suddenly, a lot of those histories now have a very unique spin. Because here we have a perfect example of potentially something artificial, something with a consciousness, I guess you could say, going out of its way, having extreme power, right, to move a planetary body, to be able to move a moon into an orbit. That's no joke. It's not impossible, right? If you can control electromagnetic fields on that scale, moving a planetary body is easy. It's not a problem. I don't know how you would do it, right? I don't have a system to propose, but if you could figure that out on that scale, moving planetary bodies is a cinch. Don't forget, the electric force is 10 to the 36th power, more powerful than gravity. So if you have a way to control electricity, and we know you can control electricity, we do it every day, although we do it the worst way you could possibly imagine. We do it the brute force way. But if you can control that, you can do whatever you want, right? The sky's the limit. Moving a planetary body is simple. So then that, of course, begs the question, what the hell has the ability to manipulate the electromagnetic force at that scale? I don't know. This is where things get crazy, right? I don't have answers for it, but maybe you do. I don't know, post it. If you've got an answer, if you might have a potential, something in our past that might explain what could do this, right? Is there, I don't know. I don't know. Okay, anyway, so the 360-day calendar. I know, we're at an hour now. That's where it came from, and that's where it went. And in the future, we'll dive deeper into each of the cultures and talk about what they saw, talk about the proof that we can use to substantiate the claims that we talked about here. Yeah. Huh. Okay, I gotta go get a life. Okay.